The Manhattan Project remains the most classified scientific operation in human history, the program that produced the first nuclear weapon the world had ever seen. In the summer of 1945, a group of men stood in the New Mexico desert before dawn and watched something they had spent 3 years building rise into the sky. None of them knew what to say, least of all the man who led them, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Some laughed, some cried. Oppenheimer himself later said he remembered a line from an ancient Hindu scripture.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Another walked up to him afterward, said nothing, and looked back at the sky. They had just detonated the first nuclear weapon in human history, and almost every one of them, in some way they couldn't fully explain, already knew they had done something that could not be undone. This is not the story of a bomb. It is the story of the people who built it, what they knew, what they were told, what they chose, and what they carried for the rest of their lives. Over 600,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project. Most of them had no idea what they were building. 3 years. At a cost so massive, it would equal tens of billions today. 3 secret cities that didn't exist on any map. And at the center of all of it, a group of the sharpest minds on Earth, working towards something the world was never meant to have. In August of 1942, the United States government built 3 cities and erased them from every map in existence. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, New Mexico. Each one constructed from nothing, each one sealed off from the outside world, each one home to thousands of people who signed documents agreeing never to speak about what happened inside. Oak Ridge alone reached 75,000 residents by May of 1945. Families lived there, children went to school there, and almost none of them knew what the facility around them was actually producing. That was the design. The Manhattan Project ran on compartmentalization, the deliberate practice of making sure no single person outside the inner circle could ever see the full picture. Workers built components without knowing what those components were for. Engineers solved problems without knowing what problem they were ultimately solving. A man could spend 2 years constructing a door to a room he would never be allowed to enter. Even the Vice President of the United States had no idea. Harry Truman, who had served in that office for months, learned about the Manhattan Project only after Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945, at which point he became president, and the full weight of what his country had been building landed on him without warning. 600,000 people, at a cost so massive it would equal tens of billions today. 3 years of work that never stopped across dozens of sites. And at the top of it all, one man responsible for making the science actually work, J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from New York, who had never managed anything close to this scale, placed in charge of the most consequential scientific program in human history. The scientists who came to Los Alamos were not soldiers. They were physicists, chemists, mathematicians, people who had spent their careers in university laboratories thinking about atoms, not weapons. Many of them had fled Europe specifically to escape the kind of destruction they were now being asked to create. Enrico Fermi, the man who had achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction, under a Chicago stadium in 1942, had left Italy after the fascist government stripped his Jewish wife of her citizenship. Leo Szilard had watched Nazi Germany rise and left his homeland years before the war reached him. Niels Bohr had escaped occupied Denmark. Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, John von Neumann, men who had crossed an ocean to be free, now working in a sealed mountain compound in New Mexico, building the most destructive thing in human history. What brought them there was not comfort with violence. It was fear. In 1939, Albert Einstein signed a letter to President Roosevelt, warning that Nazi Germany was likely pursuing nuclear research. The fear that Hitler might get there first drove everything that followed. That fear was real. Germany had Werner Heisenberg, one of the architects of quantum mechanics, working on their nuclear program. What the Allied scientists didn't know, and wouldn't know until after the war, was that the German program had stalled years earlier and posed no real threat. They built the bomb. To stop a weapon, that was never coming. And by the time they knew that, the machine was already moving too fast to stop. Oppenheimer understood the contradiction better than most. A theoretical physicist who quoted Sanskrit poetry, read philosophy, and spoke 6 languages. He had no obvious profile for military leadership, but he could hold a room of the most stubborn minds on Earth and make them work together. General Groves, who ran the military side of the project, later said choosing Oppenheimer was the best decision he made. He also said Oppenheimer was probably the most dangerous man he had ever met. After 3 years of secrecy, fear, and work that never stopped, the Manhattan Project had arrived at the only moment that mattered. In the New Mexico desert, the scientists who had spent years calculating theories and assembling components were about to find out if a weapon the world had never seen would actually work. They called it Trinity. On the morning of July 16, 1945, at 5:29, the New Mexico desert went white. Not bright, white. A flash so complete that observers standing 2 miles away saw the bones in their own hands through closed eyes. The steel tower holding the device 100 feet tall, built specifically for this test, ceased to exist. The sand beneath it melted into glass. Green, mildly radioactive glass that scientists later named Trinitite. Fragments of it still exist today. The device was called Gadget. 13 pounds of plutonium, expected to release the equivalent of 0.3 kilotons of TNT. What it released was 21 kilotons, equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, roughly 1,500 times more powerful than the largest conventional bomb used in World War II. 70 times the projected force. 3 years of calculation, and the result came back 70 times stronger than anyone planned for. Nobody moved for a long time. Fermi dropped scraps of paper before and after the blast wave reached him, measured the displacement with his eyes, and walked away with a rough yield estimate before any instrument had been read. Feynman, 23 miles out, watched without protective goggles, reasoning that the truck windshield would block the ultraviolet. He described a ball of orange that turned black at the edges and kept rising. Oppenheimer said nothing immediately. His brother Frank stood next to him. What Frank remembered afterward was the silence, not the explosion, but the silence that followed it, before the sound caught up with the light. In that silence, Robert looked at what he had built and thought of a god taking on his true form to show a prince the weight of duty. The test had worked. The question of whether it should have was already too late to ask. 21 days after Trinity, Hiroshima ceased to exist as it was. After Japan rejected the Potsdam Declaration's demand for unconditional surrender, the decision was made. August 6, 1945. A single aircraft, the Enola Gay, carrying a single bomb called Little Boy, built from uranium rather than plutonium. The city had been chosen in part because it remained largely undamaged by conventional bombing, which meant the effect of the new weapon could be measured cleanly. Somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people died in the first moments. By the end of 1945, the number reached approximately 210,000. The Hibakusha atomic bomb survivors would carry the physical and psychological scars for generations. 3 days after Hiroshima, Nagasaki followed. Japan surrendered on August 14th. The scientists at Los Alamos heard the news by radio, like everyone else. Some celebrated. The war was over. Men who had worked in isolation for 3 years could finally go home, see their families, say what they had done. For many of them, that night felt like relief, the kind that comes when something you feared might fail instead worked, and worked completely. Others went quiet and stayed that way. Leo Szilard had spent the weeks before Hiroshima collecting signatures on a petition urging Truman not to use the bomb without warning. 70 scientists signed it. It never reached the president. After the news broke, Szilard stopped talking about the project in public for years. Oppenheimer stood before his colleagues at Los Alamos in October of 1945 and said that if atomic weapons were used again in numbers, against cities, mankind would curse the names of Los Alamos and Hiroshima. He resigned his directorship shortly after. In 1954, the government stripped him of his security clearance, accusing him of disloyalty. The man who built the bomb that ended the war was deemed a threat to the country that gave him the mission. But Trinity was not the end of the story. The Soviets tested their first nuclear weapon in 1949, 4 years after Trinity. Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who had worked inside Los Alamos, had passed detailed technical information to Soviet intelligence throughout the project. The secret that 600,000 people had kept from the world lasted 4 years before the world it was kept from built one of its own. The Manhattan Project ended. The question it opened never did. The men who built the bombs scattered. Some returned to universities and spent the rest of their careers in basic research, as far from weapons work as they could get. Some stayed inside the system and helped design what came next. Oppenheimer spent his remaining years writing and speaking stripped of his clearance, excluded from the world he helped create, trying to explain to anyone who would listen what it felt like to know you had changed something permanently. He died in 1967. By then, the United States and the Soviet Union together held enough nuclear weapons to end human civilization several times over. The arms race that Trinity started was already 2 decades old, and nothing suggested it would stop. Today, 9 countries hold nuclear weapons. The total count sits somewhere above 13,000 warheads. Every one of them traces a direct line back to a desert in New Mexico, a device called Gadget, and a group of men who believed they were building something to stop a threat that no longer existed. What they actually built was a new kind of permanent uncertainty, the knowledge that the species now had the ability to end itself, and that this knowledge could not be taken back. Oppenheimer understood that from the moment the desert went white, he said the physicists had known sin. Not the sin of building a weapon, the sin of knowing exactly what they were doing and doing it anyway because once the possibility existed, someone was always going to build it. The question they couldn't answer then is the same one that hasn't been answered since. When you build something the world was never meant to have, what do you do with what you know?